So today I want to talk about Iran-Saudi relations in the 1970s. And as I was preparing this lecture, I was thinking about, how to, or which information to include, what should I exclude. It is so much that I have come across in multiple archives. I've come across so many documents and data and information, and I was thinking about how to sort of navigate this talk, what to tell you, what not to tell you. So I decided to focus on Iran-Saudi relations. But in fact, I've done more than that in my dissertation. I think it makes sense to maybe give you a bit of an understanding of what it was that I've actually been doing these past couple of years, 4 years to be precise. So I want you to imagine a relationship between two countries, between two people, that is mostly represented like this. Now, for those who do not know who these people are, on your right side, you see King Faisal of Saudi Arabia. He was the Saudi monarch until 1975, until he was assassinated. And I think the guy to my left side, he needs no introduction in this room. This is Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, and he was the Iranian monarch, the last Iranian monarch, and as you know, he left the country in 1979. So when you look at Iran-Saudi relations, when you look at the literature on Iran-Saudi relations, mostly their relationship is depicted like the one you see in the picture. There was a bit of tension, a bit of mistrust, but mostly it was kind of a cooperative and friendly relationship. So imagine this is the idea you get once you consult the literature, but then in reality, the relationship looked much closer to the one that you see on this picture. Now, the first picture that I've shown you is actually, this one is obviously AI generated, but this one is an actual image of the two of them. And when you see, there's like physical distance, but also they do not look that happy, I would say. And as I was becoming more familiar with the topic, I realized that this was actually what I wanted to look at, what I wanted to focus on, about how the relationship between these two countries was at the end. Early into my research, I came across this book, which I can recommend to everyone here. It's by Andrew Scott Cooper. It's called The Oil Kings. And Cooper basically shows that the countries, Iran and Saudi, they were in constant competition with each other, competing for regional leadership, US favored, but also influence over OPEC, the Organization for Petroleum Exporting Countries. He actually even showed that at one point in 1973, there was Iran-US contingency planning with regards to Saudi Arabia in case the As Saud monarchy was losing control in the country. And in 1975, the Shah took this all a bit further. He then even proposed a joint Iranian-Egyptian military intervention to safeguard Saudi oil fields. Now, as you know, the As Saud monarchy is still in power, the Shah not. So it kind of gives you an idea, I think, about how secure he felt for a very long time and how much he looked upon other countries. So when I came across this book, I thought, something is missing in the literature. How come Cooper shows this? But when you look at the vast majority of literature, you get a different idea. Pretty much at the same time, I came across this book, which I can also highly recommend. It's called Nixon, Kissinger, and the Shah. It's by Roham Al-Bandi, who's a professor at London School of Economics. And what he basically showed is that the Shah was, at least in the last decade of his reign, he was not a puppet of the United States, but he became a strategically autonomous actor, and he used this Iran-US alliance to his own, for his own purposes and to advance his own regional ambitions. So I was thinking, if on the one hand you have this one book which shows that the Shah was stepping out of the shadow of the US, but at the same time you have this idea of Iran-Saudi relations, which does not seem to be coherent in a way. I tried to bring these two topics together because I like them both so much, which kind of led me to the idea to look a bit more into the Nixon Doctrine. For those of you who do not know what the Nixon Doctrine is, so in the late 1960s, the US was entangled in a Vietnam War, and the idea was for Nixon when he became president in '69, how to prevent further Vietnams from happening. So the idea was, instead of being militarily involved in those regions and sending troops, maybe the allies in those regions and countries, they should actually take care of security themselves, and the US would support them financially and also but also with weapons. Now, in the case of the Persian Gulf, this translated into the so-called twin pillar policy, where Iran and Saudi Arabia were supposed to cooperate with each other to safeguard Western interests. Now, I was thinking, if in fact there was this US policy that wanted these two countries to cooperate, if the Shah indeed cooperated with Saudi Arabia, did he do it because he felt he had to, because he had to follow US orders, or did he do it because he wanted it himself, because it was good for his own strategic ambitions? And if he didn't cooperate, what did it tell about his autonomy? Was he really autonomous, or were there different factors that kind of prevented him from cooperating with Saudi Arabia? As you see, I'm dropping all of these aspects, just so you know that I've been working on all of these things. And if you want, we can talk about it in the Q&A. But for this talk, I will actually talk about Iran-Saudi relations and focus more on that and less on the Nixon Doctrine and strategic autonomy of the Shah. In this lecture, I will basically give you two parts. In the first part, I think I will talk more broadly about what happened in the Persian Gulf in the late 60s and 70s. I think in order to understand Iran-Saudi relations, you need to have a better understanding about the transformations in the region in the 60s and 70s. In the second half, then I will talk about Iran-Saudi relations more general. So I called this slide Thinking the Unthinkable, because what happened in January 1968 was actually thinking the unthinkable, because Great Britain announced it would leave the Persian Gulf after 150 years. This was big news because just 2 months before that, they sent an official to the Persian Gulf countries, reassuring them that they would stay. And then only 2 months later, they actually said, well, guys, bye-bye, we have to go. We cannot stay here. Great Britain was not just for 150 years, not just the dominant external power, it was the dominant power, the hegemon of the region. So nobody really knew what this would actually mean for the Persian Gulf if Great Britain was leaving. And some actually thought it would open this box of Pandora, new conflicts would maybe would emerge, maybe new wars, and nobody really knew what this would mean. Many open questions remained, and I want to focus on 4 which are kind of relevant for this talk, but I also think were the most important ones for Great Britain too. So the first one is what would actually happen with its so-called protected states, states that were basically under the protection of Great Britain. Great Britain controlled their foreign policy, defense policy. Those were Bahrain, Qatar, and the Trucial states, which we now know as the UAE. So what would happen to those? Those were very small entities. Great Britain didn't really think they could survive without the country being present in the Persian Gulf. The second question, which is related to this, is who would actually keep those larger Persian Gulf states, for example, Iran, Iraq, and Saudi Arabia, in check, because they were vying for dominance. They wanted to actually be dominant, and the Shah himself made it quite clear that he wanted to be the new Great Britain in the Persian Gulf. The next question was, how could Western interests be preserved? Now, 2 interests here were the most important ones. The first one being how to safeguard the free flow of oil for the West. And the second one was how to contain Soviet infiltration and the rise of communism in the Persian Gulf. And the last one was basically how could some territorial disputes be solved by 1971. They only had 3 years left, and most of these territorial disputes also were related to Iran. So as you see, most of these questions somehow were always related to Iran and how Iran would actually would sort of respond to it. So as Great Britain was preparing itself to withdraw, the very first idea was someone has to take up the responsibilities that we had so far. Now, the only superpower that came to mind was the US, which did make sense in a way. The US was also gaining more influence in the region, so it made sense to look at the US. But the US, as it was fighting in Vietnam, early on said, we cannot do this. We will not get approval from Congress, but also we will not get approval from US citizens. We cannot get involved there anymore. You have to find another solution. And the US was also not very happy that Great Britain just sort of made this decision so abruptly. They also were not prepared for that in a way. then the idea was, okay, let's look at what do we have in that region. Maybe we can work with some of these countries. Maybe they can actually share the burden. And the idea was to create this indigenous balance between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which sounds nice, but was very difficult to achieve. These countries were not really cooperating to begin with, and also there was a lot of mistrust and tension, so they didn't really know if that made sense. Also, Iran was the dominant power amongst all of those Persian Gulf countries, so how could they actually make sure that Iran would kind of cooperate with Saudi Arabia and see Saudi Arabia as an equal partner? And then also, could Saudi Arabia even step up and also become the country that Great Britain wanted it to be? The other issue, which was kind of important and pressing, was the one about those protected states. So the idea was those small entities cannot survive on their own, but maybe if we put them together in a union or federation, maybe then they can actually survive. Maybe we can make sure that they will not be, let's say, eaten up by the bigger states. But that was also very difficult because there was tension between those entities themselves, and at the same time, one entity, Bahrain, that was supposed to become part of that federation was claimed by Iran, as probably some of you know. And the second issue was that some islands, Greater Toom, Lesser Toom, and Abu Musa, were also supposed to come under the control of the federation, but again, Iran actually claimed those islands. So again, here, as you see, most of the problems that Great Britain had sort of were always related to Iran. Now let's look at this first question, what happens to Bahrain? And I think a lot of you are still talking about the Bahrain issue. I personally have heard about it a lot in these past couple of years. I've heard some interesting takes, so let me maybe give you a bit of insights on how it actually looked like in the 70s. So Bahrain was actually considered a province of Iran. And in the Iranian parliament, there was one seat reserved for the representative of Bahrain. Obviously, that seat was always vacant because Bahrain didn't really think it belonged to Iran. But still, the seat was there, and I think it gives you an idea about how entrenched this idea of Bahrain belonging to Iran was in Iranian society and politics. So that in 1968, when the idea of the federation was taking shape, the Iranian newspaper Italat wrote that the inclusion of Bahrain into the federation would be a colonial act, and it was absolutely unacceptable to Iran to accept anything like this. But they didn't really know about what the Shah was planning, because the Shah thought that maybe there were more advantages when he relinquished his claim on Bahrain than disadvantages. I came across this document from 1965 in the UK National Archives where the Shah speaks, 65, so a couple of years before British withdrawal, he speaks to the British Prime Minister and says, Bahrain is not attractive to us, not economically, not financially. It has no pearls, no oil, and also demographically, it could be an issue for us in the future because there are just not enough Iranians. There are way too many Arabs there. What if at the end, if it becomes part of Iran, they will actually start a revolution, and then maybe we will lose other parts of our territory, like Khuzestan in the south. So he was thinking about, even in 65, about how to solve this issue without losing his face. So he, without basically consulting with his advisors, without consulting with Great Britain, in January 1969, he announced that publicly that Iran would accept the will of the people in Bahrain. And this was surprising to everyone. Nobody really saw it coming because this idea of Bahrain belonging to Iran was so sort of entrenched in Iranian society and politics that nobody thought that the Shah would actually give it up. But the Shah was also, aside from all those issues he thought Bahrain would cause in the future, he actually thought, I want to be the dominant power in this region. I want to be the leader of the Persian Gulf. And for that, I need the approval of Arab states. So maybe if I give up Bahrain, I look like a great statesman, and I can actually gain back some trust and then be accepted as the dominant power, maybe even the hegemon of the region. So if you ask me, I think it was a very strategic move, which still, until today, causes a lot of discussion amongst Iranians. And we can maybe talk about that later, too. And it actually did help him, to be honest. He gained back some trust with the Arabs, but you can see when you look at discussions after January 1969 between Iran and Arab states, they always sort of applaud him for what he did and that he showed that they could trust him and so on and so forth. But then something else happened which sort of didn't really help his case, I would say. Because the next question was, now that Bahrain was solved, what will happen to the islands? And this was a far more difficult topic. So those islands, and you see them here on the, in red, so Tumbe Kuchak, Tumbe Bozorg, and Abu Musa, so Abu Musa was supposed to come under the control of Sharjah, and the tombs were supposed to come under the control of Ras Al Khaimah when the British left. And Iran didn't necessarily agree with it, and one reason why they didn't like the whole idea of federation was that they saw it as a plan from Great Britain to stay there without actually being there. And this was by sort of undermining Iranian influence and power, and by including those Persian Gulf islands into the federation, they were trying to Arabize the Persian Gulf, which is something that Etilat titled. Now, Iran maintained two arguments about the sovereignty over those islands. The first one was historical. They said the islands belong to us until the end of the 19th century. The British took them away from us. Now we just have to get them back. It is our right to get them back. Well, the British said, that's okay, but show us some proof. Do you have any document to show that the islands belong to you? And then interestingly, Iran said, well, they belong to us. We don't need to show you any proof. Like, why should we do that? This is our right. They belong to us. The interesting thing about that is that when it came to Bahrain, they actually showed proof. But when it came to the islands, they just didn't want to show proof. I still, until this day, haven't seen any proof in any archive where I could see that the islands belong to Iran, but also Iran just didn't want to show any proof. Maybe they didn't even have it. I'm not sure until now. The second argument was of geostrategic nature. So Iran thought that if you want to secure the freedom of navigation, you needed a powerful country that was committed to regional stability. And in the Persian Gulf, the only country capable of doing that was Iran. No other country was powerful enough. Nobody could dominate those waters. So Iran needed to control the islands. Now, you might notice the difference. At first, I speak about sovereignty, and then I talk about control. Because in, I think, 1970, the Shah realized the whole sovereignty issue will be much more difficult. This will not something that they can solve in the next couple of years. So he said, let's put that aside. We make a U-turn. We will now only talk about controlling the islands, and at a later stage, we will, solve this whole sovereignty issue. Until today, it hasn't been solved. It is still a reason of friction between Iran and now UAE. And Saudi Arabia, for example, was actually against not talking about the sovereignty issue because they thought, how can you solve this issue without talking about sovereignty? Also, when you look at the literature, this geostrategic argument is something that is quite contested. Not everybody agrees that Iran actually needed to control those islands to control the Persian Gulf waters. Some say it made sense, some say it doesn't. The jury is still out on that. Now, Iran said, and you see that in the Zahiri papers, but you also see it when you look at the diaries of Court Minister Asadullah Alam, that there was a package deal. Great Britain said, you give up Bahrain, we give you the islands in return. But when you look at the Zahiri papers, like when Zahiri basically speaks to British officials and says, well, there was a package deal, they never really confirm it. So it's not very clear if there was such a package deal. But I think the fact that Alam wrote it in his diaries and Zahiri also kept bringing it up in discussions kind of leads me at least to believe that there was some sort of unwritten deal between the two. And apparently, and I haven't found the document myself, but there is this BBC documentary, it came out a couple of years ago, where they said, we found a document in a British archive, and it actually shows there was a package deal. So, but I haven't watched the documentary, I don't know, but just for you to know that there might be some truth to it. Now, the other thing, whether there was a package deal or not, the island issue was very important for the Shah. He actually gave an interview where he said he did not want to see those islands being auctioned off. He actually said to Alam, I will not go down in history as as the guy who lost Bahrain and the islands. I cannot. I will lose my throne this way. I will not survive this. We need to keep the islands. We cannot also lose those islands. But beyond that, he also thought if he was showing weakness on the island issue, maybe some Arab countries that were claiming that Khuzestan was Arab would actually feel sort of empowered to maybe claim Khuzestan for themselves or, help separatist movements. So he was also thinking a bit more ahead. Now, at the end, in November 1971, a month before Great Britain left the Persian Gulf, they finally reached an agreement, but only with the Sheikh of Sharjah, where it was said that Iran would control the islands, but they would share any resources that they found there. But he could not reach an agreement over Abu Musa with the Sheikh. No, he could not reach an agreement with the Sheikh of Ras Al Khaimah over the tombs. He was much more adamant on his position. And then in November 1971, one day before Great Britain left, Iran finally seized those islands militarily. I believe the fact that he did so one day before Great Britain left was to basically show them, we are the new power, you cannot do anything against this. But also when you look at how Iran perceived this, or how the media in Iran reported about it, they said that after 80 years, Iran erased the last sign of colonialism in the Persian Gulf. Now, it is interesting. I want you to remember this quote because this is a very Iranian position, because Arab countries actually thought this was a new form of colonialism in the shape of Iran. And Iran was now being sort of also advancing colonial interests, taking Arab land. And especially for Saudi Arabia, this was a big issue that Iran did so, which I will talk in a bit more about. Now let's look at Iran-Saudi relations in general. There were a few issues that they had to overcome in order to be able to cooperate with each other. Now the first one is, and this might not be shocking to anyone here, there was a lot of mistrust and contempt between these two countries. It dated back to centuries ago, and not just between Iran and the Saudis, but also Arab countries in general were quite suspicious of Iran's growing power, and they believed Iran was an expansionist power and did even kind of compare it to Israel that was also occupying Arab territory, Palestinian land. And then also there's this one quote that from Kissinger, I think he wrote it in a memo where he said that the Arabs were genuinely fearing Iranian colonialism. So you see this whole theme of Iran being a colonial power is something you see throughout the 70s. And with Iran seizing those islands, it did make sense that Arab countries did not want to trust Iran or could not overcome their mistrust. And on the Iranian side, and this is something which is also still very present today, if you speak to Iranians today, you will hear it every now and then, that Iran sort of blamed Arab countries for everything evil that happened in Iran after they became a Muslim country. So this obviously didn't really help the two of them to come to terms. Then another very pressing issue was that Iran was entertaining relations with Israel. This was not something that Arab countries could just accept. As you know, they said Israel was claiming or occupying Arab territory. I said in the title, I say Iran's not so secret relations with Israel because it was maybe not official, but everybody knew they had very close ties. Economically, politically, financially, the ties were running quite deep. And on this picture, for example, you see Iranian officials and Israeli officials in the IDF headquarters in Israel. The man on the very left is actually Hassan Toufanian, who was a very important military figure and high-ranking military figure at the time. Now, Iran actually liked the idea that Israel existed because he thought that another non-Arab country, another non-Sunni country would be in Iran's advantage because it would kind of keep the attention away from itself. Arab countries would be so busy and focused on Israel that Iran could kind of do whatever it wanted to do. But on the other hand, as I said, Iran wanted to be the dominant power, so it needed the Arab countries, it needed their recognition, approval to be that dominant power and to lead the region. So he had to tread lightly. He had to balance this the entire time, his relations with Israel, in order to not antagonize the Arab countries, but also on the other hand, to actually stay close to Israel, which was beneficial to him. Iran and Israel actually shared some threat perception. It did have a lot of shared interests. They were both afraid of the Soviet Union. They were both afraid of anti-monarchical tendencies that were rising in the region. They were sort of afraid of Arab radicalism, and they didn't really like the idea that there was a pro-Soviet Egypt under Nasser in the region. And at the same time, as I said, the Shah tried to balance this relationship. He, in the late 60s and also throughout the 70s, started to condemn Israeli occupation of Palestinian territories. He did that continuously, which kind of helped him gaining back some trust with Arab countries. But at the same time, he would never cut his relations with Israel. And throughout the 70s, actually, the relationship became even much stronger in military and economic terms. There's this one quote that I also put here. I found it also in Alam's diary, where the Shah told Alam that Iran couldn't accept Israel's policy, which is occupying Arab territory, but he was happy that Israel was putting the Arabs to their places to some extent. So you always see this, contempt when he speaks about Arab countries, and also why he tried to keep Israel close to itself. Now, when you look at the current literature, I think there's an overemphasis on, the Shah distancing himself from Israel, becoming closer to Arab countries. I don't necessarily agree with that. I think that the Shah was quite strategic in the way that he approached his neighbors. And there's this one interview from 1976, I think, with a US magazine, where the Shah actually says, if we were to accept that Israel can just occupy territory, then maybe in the future, if someone occupies our territory, like Khuzestan, for example, then nobody will do anything else. So we always have to oppose that because this could be an issue for us in the future. So even when he was supporting the Palestinian cause, I don't think it was because of altruistic reasons, but it was more strategic thinking from his side. Now, I believe that Saudi Arabia could even overcome this issue. It could overcome the fact that there was mistrust tension and also Iran entertaining relations with Israel. But there was one thing that Saudi Arabia could not, especially King Faisal, could not overcome, which was the whole island dispute. When you look at the literature, this is an issue that you won't really see much about, or actually nothing about, because when you look at the literature, it says that these two countries, that maybe Saudi Arabia wasn't, let's say, amused about the fact that Iran took those islands, but also it wasn't a big of an issue. It didn't matter enough to put a deep strain into their relationship. But then 2 years into my research, so I was really looking for this information for a long time. Then 2 years into my research, I finally found it. And I thought, finally, it makes sense. It makes sense that I worked on this topic for all this time. Because I realized that it was a much deeper issue for Saudi Arabia and something that it didn't want to overcome, and also something that would come up throughout the 70s. Now, when you look at the Zahiri papers, Ardashi Zahiri said that King Faisal actually was not willing to darken their relations because of those islands. They just didn't matter enough. He also said that the Saudi ambassador in London told him that before solving the Bahrain issue, the islands should be given to Iran. Now, when you see that, you basically think that those islands just don't matter enough. And I do believe that maybe at some point, those words were being voiced by Saudi Arabia. Another thing was also that Saudi Arabia sort of said, we will support you in your claim with the islands when you give up Bahrain. This is also something you see in the Zahiri papers. So Iran kind of expected the Saudis to act upon those words and to support them and maybe to put in a good word with those sheikdoms of Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah. But Saudi Arabia was reluctant and said, why should we deal with this? You have to talk to Great Britain. This is not our issue, not our business. We will not do anything against it. But instead of not doing anything, Saudi Arabia was actually behind closed doors, sort of rooting for Sharjah and Ras Al Khaimah and basically telling them, this is your territory, this is Arab, you cannot give it up. You cannot give it up, you have to be adamant about this. As you know, Iran then actually seized those islands, and it actually deceived Saudi Arabia because just a few days before they took those islands, they reassured the Saudis that they would not do this. They would not seize those islands, especially not militarily, and they would find a political solution. But then, as you know, they seized the islands, and this definitely did not help with gaining back trust from Saudi Arabia, but in fact, the Saudis saw themselves confirmed. You cannot trust Iran, you cannot trust the Shah. Then basically a year, nothing happens. There's not really talk about those islands, even though the Shah did acknowledge that it was apparently an issue, but he thought they could overcome it. Then in October 1972, King Faisal actually approached, I don't think even the US government, but some person very close to the US government, and told them basically, I have a proposal. We should solve the island issue because Iran has embarrassed me a year ago. I have to gain back trust with the Arab countries because Saudi Arabia also wanted to be a leader in that region, especially on the Arab side. Then again, you don't hear much about it. It seems like it was just maybe a proposal, but nothing came out of it. But then in July 1973, Iran's foreign minister, Khaled Bari, he goes to Jeddah and was blindsided because King Faisal actually told him, we will solve this issue, and if you are prepared to settle this whole island issue, I will even give up our claim on the Bahrain oasis, which is a big deal. If that was actually said, it is a big deal, and it shows how important those islands were to Saudi Arabia. Khaled Bari didn't really know what to say. He wasn't prepared. He goes back to the Shah, tells him about it. The Shah was basically hopping mad. He couldn't understand why King Faisal was again pressing this issue. And then he did something which was not very diplomatic. He wrote this letter, a very harshly worded letter, basically saying, back off, this is our territory, you have nothing to say, it's not your business, just leave us alone. His advisors actually told him not to do that, and maybe, talk to them instead of writing something, but the Shah didn't listen to them, and then he sent that letter, and as you can imagine, it didn't really help his case, and it also didn't help King Faisal sort of being reassured that maybe he could cooperate with Iran. And I believe that this is the make it or break it point in the 70s between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and that this is something that unfortunately has not really come up in the literature, but should have come up, because I think it also explains a lot about the development between these two countries, also when it comes to oil and OPEC. I want to talk about two examples of cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia, or as I say, cooperation that didn't really materialize between them. The first one is the idea of having a security pact between all Persian Gulf countries. This was something that the Shah actually voiced early on in 1968. He said, Great Britain is leaving, don't worry, we will actually work out something with Arab countries, we will have a security agreement, we will get this done. But he didn't really think that it would be such a difficult thing to fulfill. I think he also didn't think that the mistrust was running so deep, because it was not just Saudi Arabia that was fearing Iran's ambitions or was hesitant, but actually most Arab states didn't really share Iran's position of having a security agreement. They were also scared of Iran's ambitions and of its colonial ambitions, as I said. But also they thought that there was only one reason why Iran wanted to have such a pact, which was to sort of counter Iraq. And Arab states did not want to get involved in the friction that existed between Iran and Iraq, so they said, we will not have an agreement with you. Now, throughout the 70s, the Shah keeps going to Arab states or sends officials to Arab countries asking them to come up with an agreement. At some point, he says, well, if we can't have one together, let's have only have bilateral agreements. Also didn't work out. Then he at some point said, you get together, you have an agreement, and then you come to us and we work something out. Also didn't work out. Then in 1976, finally, these countries came together, the Persian Gulf countries, they came together to discuss defense proposals for the Persian Gulf, which was a big thing and hadn't happened in over 10 years. The proposals that they put forward ranged from establishing a comprehensive agreement, which Iran favored, to no agreement at all, which is something that Iraq wanted. Iraq only wanted to have bilateral agreements. But then, they still didn't really trust Iran, and also those countries didn't trust themselves either. So I also have to say, it's not just that there was friction between Iran and Arab countries, but also between those countries themselves. So nothing came out of that meeting, unfortunately. But there's actually one thing that I came across, I think 6-7 weeks before I submitted my dissertation, one piece of information which was quite vital, I think, for the whole story, but which is sort of leaves me with more questions, I would say, than answers. So I came across this book by Banafsheh Keynoush, who works on Iran-Saudi relations, who sort of, I think she published a book where she collected all of her own archival material that she had collected throughout the years. And in that book, she argues that in 1977, Saudi Arabia attempted to conclude a region-wide Gulf security agreement, inclusive of Iran and Iraq. And then she also says that Iran and the Saudis, they had finally signed an agreement to partition a neutral zone between them, which is a big thing if it actually happened. And then in July 1978, she says that Prince Fahd of Saudi Arabia, he actually traveled to Iran to seal the security pact, to finally sign it. But then, as you know, autumn came. The Shah was really struggling to maintain his grip on power, and then the revolution happened, and this pact was did not come to fruition at the end. Now, for me, as a historian, I think when I see something like this, there's so many what-ifs in my head. What would have actually happened if there was such an agreement? Would it have an effect on Iran-Saudi relations today? Maybe it would have changed also how Saudi Arabia behaved after the revolution. We don't really know. I haven't also come across anything else that kind of confirms what Banafsheh Keynoush has said, but I think it is a vital piece of information that she has given. I also believe that there was a switch when King Faisal died, because the Shah respected him, but he didn't really think he was a great leader, and he also thought he was way too slow. He was way too ideologically driven. But Prince Fahd, who was not the king, but was sort of, I would say, the one who was handling most of the matters, that was a person that the Shah could work with. He was less ideologically driven, much more pragmatic, and someone who could, also forget about the fact that Iran, for example, was working with Israel, and as long as it maybe somehow helped Saudi interests. So I do believe that this could have been, if the Shah was, if he actually stayed in power, that maybe this change in the Saudi monarchy could have actually had a long-lasting impact on those relations, but we just will never know because the Shah is not there anymore. But still, I wanted to share this whole aspect of the failed security pact with you, which is also not that, I would say, just mentioned briefly in most of the literature and not something that has been discussed a lot, but I think it is interesting and shows how difficult it was for these two to compromise their own positions and come to agreements with each other. Now, this is something I call the prime example of failed cooperation, but when you look at the literature, this is actually the prime example of cooperation, mostly. The cooperation between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the Dhofar War in Oman. So in the 60s, there was this Marxist or leftist movement in Dhofar in the south of Oman that tried to control basically that region. And so the Sultan Qaboos, the Sultan of Oman, he was really struggling to deal with them and was also fearing in a way to lose maybe power and for this group actually extending their power. So in 1972, he actually asked the Shah to come and support him. So this is, and the Shah actually did. He tried to support him against those guerrillas of the Popular Front in the south of Oman. Then in 1973, he extended that support, and Sultan Qaboos invited him to actually deploy Iranian troops in Oman. Now, this was something they tried to keep on the low because they knew that those Arab neighbors would not take it very lightly or would not really agree with that. But at some point, they also couldn't hide it because it was out in the open. And in 1975, for example, it was estimated that around 5,000 Iranian troops were located in Oman. And most Arab countries actually condemned Iran for doing that. And Saudi Arabia was actually one of those countries that was voicing it the loudest, I would say. Which, is weird when you look at the literature and they say that they actually cooperated. And there was a sort of a division of work between the two countries. Iran would help militarily and Saudi Arabia would give the money. But at the end, it was not really that way, I would say. So the Saudis were quite anxious about Iranian support in Oman And they actually thought that Iran might bring the entire Persian Gulf under its control. And they tried to prevent that. So they would say, Iran should get out, don't let the Iranians in, we will solve the issue differently. But the fact of the matter is that the Saudis couldn't do the things that Iran was doing. So they could complain, but they couldn't actually send troops themselves. They couldn't become militarily involved. So they couldn't really change the assistance that Iran was giving. But what is interesting when you look at archival data and also, for example, the Zahiri papers, Iranian officials actually asked the British, but also the US, what is Saudi Arabia doing in Dhofar? We have no idea. They're not sharing information with us. At some point, there was so much tension between them that the Shah asked the British if the Saudis were actually working against him in Oman. So I think this kind of shows that there was no cooperation, not even a tacit understanding between the two, which is the impression you get when you read the literature. But in fact, these two countries were not even communicating on basic information. So at the end, I think the last Iranian troops left in 1977. Actually, a couple of years ago, I was in Oman, just to give you an anecdote. I was in Oman, and I didn't know anything about this issue back then. That was 10 years ago. I didn't know anything about it. So I go to Oman, and then some Omanis tell me, oh, you know that the only reason Sultan Qaboos is still here are you. Like, what happened? I have no idea about it. And then I read about it, and now I know what they were talking about. So it's still an issue that they talk about, which is kind of fascinating to me. So at the end, Oman actually acknowledged that Saudi Arabia did also, contribute in a way to saving the throne, but it also insisted that it was Iranian effective military aid and not Saudi assistance that made the difference. And when you look at British archival documents, but also US archival documents, they confirm that too. They basically say, well, it's nice that the Saudis did a few things, but it was actually Iran that saved Sultan Qaboos. And I think this whole episode also shows how dominant Iran was compared to the Saudis, and how the Shah, in pretty much all of matters related to security, could actually get his own way and could advance his own ambitions and interests in the region, and that the Saudis never really could keep up for a very long time, at least. Well, except for OPEC, when it came to dominating OPEC and oil, that was a different issue, something I haven't really focused on my own dissertation. But when it came to security or politically, Iran was the power, acknowledged also by some of the Arab countries, but also mostly by Western countries. And at the end, there was no such thing as cooperation. Not just formal cooperation, but I also think there was such a lack of communication between these two countries in so many matters that I don't really think they had, I would say, strong communication channels or any channel to solve issues. They always had to go back to the British or the US to get help to sort of negotiate or to help solve their issues. With that, I will finish this presentation. Thank you for listening to me, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Something that didn't come up in your presentation was that the majority of the people in Bahrain are Shias, and Iranian were Shias. But I think they were right to let this Bahrain go, because they do not feel close. People do not feel close with Iran, unlike the Shias in Saudi Arabia and Iraq, that they feel close to Iran. I don't think they like Iran, because most of all, they are Arabs. So I think there was a problem maintaining Bahrain militarily and politically. That was one issue. So I'm going to just leave it like that. There is another issue that Shah mentioned, but that's fine. I just think that.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, it's mostly, I think 60% of the population in Oman are Shias. But I also believe that, as you said, the majority was Arab. So it would, I really think, this is my personal opinion, that the Shah was quite strategic when it came to Bahrain. And I think that in the long term, it actually did make sense to give up Bahrain. And I also don't really see, now I'm thinking about, imagine Bahrain was actually part of Iran. I don't really think this would have solved anything for Iran. I think it would have caused much more problems than actually giving up Bahrain. And also it didn't, as I said, it did make the Shah look like a great statesman, that he was willing to give up things that he wanted to cooperate with his neighbors and to sort of mend the fences.
Thank you so much. I like the quote you brought about Kissinger about Arabs fearing Iranian colonialism, but first of all, what did they imagine Iranian colonialism like as actually manifesting as? Like, was it more exerting influence, getting involved in conflicts like Oman, or was it they genuinely was afraid of like territorial ambitions? And also, how legitimate like was their fear?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the most issue was, what was actually meant when when Arab countries were afraid of Iranian colonialism. Were they afraid that Iran was actually taking Arab territories, or was it more about Iran advancing its own interest? I think both. But the issue with grabbing Arab territory, that was a big deal, which you saw in the case of the islands. But then also when it came to Oman, for example, they also saw this. Oh, this is maybe another way for Iran to actually get Arab territory, because who will tell us that Iran is actually leaving? Maybe Iran will stay and will somehow also control Oman. I don't think it was just about grabbing territory, but also having so much political leverage over an Arab country that they could actually dictate the terms in those countries, for example, in Oman, but also, in other countries. I start with you, Martin.
I'm curious, to the extent you can speak to this, how much was this fissure between Iran and Saudi relations, to the extent that there were tensions? How much was that in line with the Nixon Doctrine that that's great, we have more people to sell weapons to and they'll kind of balance each other out, rather than us having to figure out how to balance the power over there?
Mm-hmm. Actually, I think I put a slide in there on the Nixon Doctrine in Persian Gulf. So I think this is actually interesting because the Nixon Doctrine translated into the Persian Gulf as the so-called twin pillar policy. Now, this was never something like a term that the US government has used, but it was, I think it was coined by some journalists, and then everybody picked it up. And until this day, we talk about a twin pillar policy. When you look at the documents, at the strategic documents where the US is laying out its policy, it does actually say we need cooperation between these two countries, because if we only back Iran, then maybe it will look bad for us when you want to sort of negotiate with Arab countries, but those Arab countries are not strong enough to do what Iran can do. So maybe we have to foster cooperation between these two countries. But they also acknowledge that Iran was always the preponderant power in the Persian Gulf. But then this was nice in written form, but in practice, they never really encouraged that cooperation. They didn't really get involved in their relationship, and also by militarily backing Iran to the extent that they did, there was never a balance. There was never twins. There was maybe just a one-pillar policy at the end. And it's also something that I actually say in my dissertation, that talking about a twin pillar policy is a fallacy, and we should stop talking about it, because it was never actually policy that they were following in practice. But even if they were, there was just never a balance between these two countries. They were just not equal. In so many ways, not equal. And maybe just another thing, that the Shah himself also didn't interpret the Nixon Doctrine as cooperation with Saudi Arabia. He actually saw it as a way to get more money, get more arms, advance his own military ambitions, but not necessarily that he had to cooperate with the Saudis. Yes, you're in the back.
Thank you for your talk. I had two questions. One is on the 1977 agreement. Was that supposed to be a maritime border, or like something akin to spheres of influence when you were talking about the neutral area? And then when you were talking about the Oasis claim, the Bahraini Oasis claim, is that a claim that Iran had as well, or was that on behalf of Iran?
Maybe the second one, Iran had no claim on Bahraini. I'm not even sure if it has been solved until now. Maybe, Dr. Milani, maybe you know it better. I don't know if it has been solved until now, but it was a territory that was contested between Qatar, Oman, and also the Saudis, and I think the UAE as well. But Iran had no claim in that. But for the Saudis to give up this claim in order to get an agreement or settlement on the islands was quite of a big thing. The 1977 thing, I don't know actually. Banafsheh Kainush didn't write it. I also don't know what they wanted to partition there. Was it the waters? Was it territory? Maybe also just influence, because in the literature you do read about this tacit understanding about spheres of influence between Iran and Saudi Arabia. But I don't know those territories or what they were exactly talking about.
So thank you for your talk. It's my understanding that your interest in Saudi Arabia-Iran relationship predates your fellowship here at Stanford. My interest is in knowing what you discovered in the Zahedi papers that altered your understanding of that relationship. What findings and what insight were you able to gain as a result of access to these archives? Mm-hmm. And the second part, unrelated to the first part, but second question, I think it's still relevant, is your presentation was primarily focused on this narrative around a power play between Iran and Saudi Arabia and centered around the islands and the status of Bahrain. But you made no reference to oil and how the relationship between these two countries and their cooperation at OPEC changed the role that oil played in both countries and their future. Was there a reason why you left oil out of this?
Actually, I anticipated someone asking me the second question, to be honest. I didn't prepare a slide, but I came prepared. I know the answer. So to be honest, I did it on purpose. I also didn't include it in my dissertation because when you look at the literature, when there is some discussion about friction between the two of them, it's always with regards to oil. So I didn't want to focus anymore on that. I think actually Cooper did a great job in showing the competition with regards to oil, and I didn't want to include it anymore because I thought we know about this. We know about the two of them competing, and as I said, Cooper, he even actually had multiple interviews with Zahedi himself where he also explained that position a bit better. So I didn't want to dive into that deeper myself in my dissertation, but focus on aspects that so far, the political aspect basically, that has been put on the sideline. And with regards to your first one, if I found anything in the Zahedi papers that were, yeah.
It sort of changed your understanding of the relationship, given that you've actually focused on this prior to you coming here.
So when I went to the British Archive, the UK National Archives, a couple of years ago, when you look at the documents there, you get this Iran, when Iranian officials were talking to British officials, they would always say, we get along with the Saudis, it's all good between us, we will settle the matter. But it was very superficial. So there was never anything that showed me what they were actually getting along on or what it was that they were discussing. It seemed very superficial. Now in the Zahedi papers, I think it actually confirmed that it was very superficial, that they wouldn't really, even when they talked to the Saudis, I think when you compare it to the discussions with the Israelis, for example, which you have quite a few documents in the Zahedi papers, you see how superficial those discussions were. It was mostly just flattery and we are brothers and we will get along and it will be good, but nothing more than that. But what I found was quite interesting was how, this is something I also saw in the Zahedi papers, how Iran actually, when they were talking then at a later stage to the British or to the US, they were admitting that they were not really, they didn't really know anything about what the Saudis were doing in Oman, but also in any other aspect in the Persian Gulf. And I think this just confirmed the doubts that I had about the closeness between the two of them even further. And then also when you look at the Zahedi papers, but also when you look at the diaries of Alam, the way that Iranians talk about Arabs in general, it is shocking, I have to say. Behind closed doors, the way that they speak about them is, I mean, I do understand why Arab countries don't really trust Iranians in a way, when you just look at the way that they spoke about them. And there's also another fact that, for example, the Saudis knew about that. They found out at some point that Iran was talking about them that way. And also this, I mentioned in the beginning, there was contingency planning, Iran-US contingency planning with regard to Saudi Arabia. The Saudis also found out about that at some point, that there was something like this happening. But I didn't, for example, find anything about that in the Zohari papers. It was something I was hoping to find because I didn't see any Iranian source that confirmed that. But there was none, and maybe because they tried to keep it so secret, so nothing written was there about it. But this is, for example, one aspect that I haven't been able to find more information. Maybe just one thing that I found in the Zohari papers, which I've really found was very interesting, it was Iran's relations to Israel. When you look at how Zohari spoke to Israeli officials, you get shocked. I was reading it, and I was like, no, this was not, this was probably someone else, and this is not discussions between Iran and the Israelis. It cannot be, because he was speaking so harshly and also so aggressively to them that the Israeli official, and I think it was Abba Eban, he actually said, do you speak to the Arabs the way that you speak to us? And the Zohari said, well, you took those lands, they did not belong to you, you better give them back. Basically, this is what he was saying. So this was something that changed a bit my perception, I would say, about Iran-Israel relations. Yeah, but I think just the focus also, when you look at what the focus is in the Zohari papers, I think there's much more on Israel, for example, than on the Saudis. You kind of, I think, also see who they were pivoting towards. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you.
Okay.
Curious about how Iran and Saudi Arabia were dealing with what was happening in Yemen at the time as well, when Britain pulled out of Yemen and how that might have led up to a split, or was there any connection with Iran and the Houthis there?
Actually, in I think 1969, Iran sent some jets to Saudi Arabia to support them against Yemen, which I believe is also it kind of supports the narrative that there was cooperation between them. Another interesting aspect maybe about the whole Yemen issue is that this is, I think, how the first idea of contingency planning was developed, but not between Iran and the US, but between Iran and the Saudis themselves. It was at some point the Shah said, we spoke to the Saudis, they told us, bring Iranian officials or like military into the country to help us against Yemen. But the US didn't quite believe the Shah. They didn't think that those talks were serious, and they were against that in a way because they thought it won't look good if Iranian troops are stationed in Saudi Arabia. But this first, I would say, contingency planning idea, I think, emerged there, where Iran thought about how can we actually, help the Saud monarchy to stay in power. I believe that then, as I said, the island issue happened, which made it difficult for them to cooperate with each other. But I think until then, there was a chance of these two countries actually cooperating. And this whole Yemen incident is one of those examples. Yeah. Yes?
Was the Shah right to fear any kind of domestic backlash for ceding Bahrain? Was there any meaningful criticism of him, or was he jumping shadows?
Well, I mean, we're still talking about it today, so I think it is still an issue. But he did something which I think was quite clever, because he thought we have to prepare the people for that, and we also have to change the story here in a way. So he sent the senator Masoudi, who was also the editor of Italat, this big newspaper in Iran. He sent him to Bahrain to sort of prepare some leaflets and some information on Bahrain to change the mind of the people, and then they would basically just continuously publish articles where they would basically show the Shah was such a great statement, and he gave up something so vital just to protect the area and sort of to change the idea of the people. But I think Zohari actually once said in an interview a couple of years ago that this was the biggest mistake that the Shah did. Giving up Bahrain was the biggest mistake that he did in his reign. So, and also Zahedi was actually one of those Iranian officials who was very against the fact that the Shah gave up Bahrain, and he was also voicing that that disagreement to the Shah quite vocally. Any more? Yeah.
Your talk is about the illusion of cooperation. I'm just curious to know, given that this cooperation is superficial or it had the appearance of cooperation, let's say it was real, what would have really, in your opinion, how would it have made itself manifest in policies, whether related to oil or regional competitiveness between the two nations? How would they have, on what front would they have actually been able to cooperate? This is a real question in my mind, because I can't just easily imagine this situation in which, if this was not an illusion of cooperation, but that it was real, on what fields would they have been able to cooperate anyway?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. I didn't ask myself that question, to be very honest with you. I also don't have an answer to it, I would say. I don't necessarily know. I also can't tell you would have had changed anything in terms of Iran being a dominant power, for example. Would it have changed anything? Would it have helped the Shah to sort of accommodate Arab interests more? I don't really know. I don't see it, I would say, that this would have happened. But I think at least maybe Saudi Arabia could have maybe been a bit more vocal in supporting the Shah, which would have been good for the Shah, I guess, in the Persian Gulf in general. But I also don't think it would have made big of an impact. But maybe for later relation between the two after the revolution, maybe it would have actually helped a bit to keep those communication channels open.
Adjacent question, maybe a tangential. Coming to today and the reception that MBS received at the White House last week, and all the announcements and deals, and what was it called? Very strategic, non-NATO ally of the United States. How does that, do you think, will either help or not help the calculus with Iran? The newly forged, very strong partnership between the US and Saudi, and also we know that he delivered some messages to Trump from the Iranian president and vice versa, and Trump delivered some messages back, which one of the ministers could be there around this week. And do you have any expectation with that significantly improved relationship between US and Saudi to impact on Iran?
I think, as you might know, Iran-Saudi relations have become much closer in these past couple of years when you compare it to, for example, 10 years ago. And I think for Iran, it's good. It was good back then, but it's also good now to have an Arab country as big as Saudi Arabia that shares maybe some interest, but also helps to mediate between Iran and the US. So I think in that terms, the sole fact that Iran actually gave MBS a few messages to give to the US is, I think, quite a big of a big deal. But at the same time, I think that Saudi Arabia profits from a weak Iran. And the way that Iran is right now, I don't think this is something that is an issue for the Saudis. I think they prefer it that way, that there is not really an axis of resistance anymore in the region that could threaten the Saudis, that there's no Hamas, no Hezbollah, there's a lot of destabilization also in Iran. Nobody really knows what will happen to Iran itself. So I think this is something that the Saudis kind of profit from. But at the long term, I think the last thing, even the Saudis want, and any other Arab country, is a situation where they don't know what will happen in Iran. So having this regime that is so weak right now is better for them than to have maybe a completely different regime, different system, where they don't really know. Maybe this will even be worse than what they had for the past 40 plus years. Yes?
I have two clarifying questions. Number one, did Shah ever try to instigate any uprising, ground swelling uprising in Bahrain, and more or less creating a situation where he's listening to the people of Bahrain by occupying that or taking over that country? That's number one question. Number two, you keep mentioning about Israel, Zahedi being against taking Palestinian land. Is it Palestinian land or Arab land after 1967?
That's an interesting question. I think when you look at I think there's been a shift in narrative throughout the past couple of years. When you look at the 60s and even still in the 70s, I mean, there was also no Palestinian organization to advocate for the Palestinians. So it was Arab countries. And when you look at the Zahedi papers, but also other archival material, they only talk about Arab territory. They never talk about Palestinian territory. But then, you know, in the 70s, you have Yasser Arafat, you have the Fatah movement that comes up that tries to advocate for Palestinians. And then you see a shift in how we talk about the issue. Nobody would now talk about Israel is occupying Arab land. They talk about Israel occupying Palestine. So there's a shift. But also Iran in the past didn't really talk about Palestinian land. I came actually across this one document at the Zahedi papers where the Shah, I think, he met with one of the leaders of Fatah. And then they actually gave them $350,000 to support them. This was in the, I think, mid-70s, which was, to me at least, new. I didn't know about it. But which also kind of shows that they were also sort of understanding there was not just this Arab position, but a Palestinian position. And there was sort of a Palestinian movement coming up. About the instigation, whether the Shah ever started anything like this, I didn't come across anything, to be honest. I didn't see anything like that he was actually trying to do something in Bahrain. Also, I don't think it would have been to his advantage to do so. Yeah. Yes?
I think there's actually two checks. One 350, 150,000.
Okay, yeah.
Shah gave through Al-Shir Zahedi to Al-Fatah.
Yeah.
And we see the medal from the then leader of Al-Fatah to the Shah, thanking me. And the details are in the Shah.
True, yeah, I saw that note where they thanked the Shah. But maybe you know more about why they thought it was vital to support them. Maybe if you know about it, if you want to speak about it.
Well, very simple. He wanted to have both sides. He wanted to control the PLO. Didn't take any Iranian planes. They didn't attack Iranian planes at the time. He bribed PLO to keep out of Iran's business. And PLO took the money and said thank you and trained Iranian terrorists to go fight the Shah.
So it did backfire at the end.
But then backfire. At the time, the Shah knew that they were helping, that the Iranian guerrillas were going to Palestine. They had just recently, before they sent them, arrested a group called the Palestinians, who were going to get trained by PLO. The Shah knew that. But he played both sides, as I think you have to really point to. But now that we're talking, continuing the question of where Iran and Saudi Arabia were cooperating, I think you insist correctly that there is more tension, but there's a lot of cooperation. There's cooperation against Nasser in Egypt. There's cooperation against Saudi Arabia. There's cooperation against Assad. There's cooperation against Ba'ath. The ample ways that they work together against these, financially, into deals against these. So there is that cooperation, but there is this illusion, as you say, of amity. That is also working against each other.
I believe that's right what you say, but also, for example, Nasser died in 1970, and then so this thread that also united them was gone. And how I see it is that basically this friction that prevented them from maybe deepened cooperation or even like really to cooperate with each other was really just at the end of 1971. And before that, it looked promising, also because the Shah actually said he wanted to cooperate with Saudi Arabia. But then, as you know, the whole island dispute happened and it made it very difficult. But I'm not trying to say that there was never any maybe small cooperation between them or that there was only friction and tension. But I think to uphold the this idea that they actually did cooperate and were able to compromise on vital issues, I think this is just not the truth. Yeah, so I try to counter that, but I guess not everybody will 100% agree with it. Yeah. Yes.
It's also an interesting period for foreign economic policy from both countries, if not cooperation with the evolution of cooperation between Tehran and Iran in terms of how they were investing in global religions.
Can you repeat that, please?
Oh, well, I'm wondering to what extent they may not have cooperated, but they at least engaging in pretensive dialogue about how they were investing in their countries. There was a lot of Iranian investment in Afghanistan in this time frame, for example, during the 70 years.
Actually in the late 70s, they established this one military club, I would say, the Safari Club, where they were thinking about, it was a club with Iran, Saudi Arabia, and a few other countries, I think Morocco was one of them, where they actually discussed how to stop the infiltration of communism in Africa. That's why it's called Safari Club, and it was developed with the help of the French. So this is something you see in the late 70s, that even in that term they try to cooperate with each other in a way to maybe come up with a solution to contain communism. But as I said, this is, I think, also relates back to this whole failed security pact and Keynush saying that at the end of the 70s they actually maybe had a written document. We don't really know much more about it. It's still something. I have a colleague actually who works on Iran-Africa relations, and he looks also at it from a historical perspective. And he's also trying to look more a bit into this whole Safari Club and what it actually meant. But it's not something that I focused on a lot because there was just not enough information for me to build a whole story around it. Yeah.
You mentioned potential Arab separatist movements as a peer of the Shah. Were there active places where the Saudis or other Arab states were funding those groups or training?
Those separatist movements, you mean? In the 70s, actually, Dr. Milanis told me something a couple of weeks ago. It's something I still haven't come across, that they were apparently, the Shah thought that they were sort of financing Islamist groups in Iran itself. I think this is what you told me. So this would be maybe in 55. Okay, yeah. But it's not something I came across, and I have to be honest, I put the focus on what Iran was doing. Obviously, because of my language skills, it just made more sense. And I also wanted to see that Iranian position and what Iran was doing. So less seeing what the Saudis were doing. But I think this would be actually interesting also to, do more research on that in the future. Yes.
Out of curiosity, working with the Zahedi papers, are they primarily in Persian or in English? And what level of language skills do you have to be able to navigate through the Persian section, given that they may not be typed or they may be handwritten notes, which could pose a challenge even for me?
Yeah. I actually think Dr. Milani wrote in one of his books that Zahedi was famous for his bad handwriting. Yeah, it's a good question. Well, most of the documents I think were in Persian. And the ones that were typewritten are very easy for me. I can read them, understand them, that's not an issue. But the ones that were actually his own notes, I really couldn't decipher them. So what I did, I actually sent all of them to my dad, and we just went through them one by one, just for me to understand what did he actually write. Most of them I had the feeling was a repetition of what I found in those typewritten notes. But then sometimes it was also just some names and just some drawings. And I didn't really know what did he actually mean with it, which meeting was he referring to. So that was, I would say, a difficult task for me, the handwritten notes. Yeah. And then you have some things in German, which also was good for me, and a bit of French, I think, too, and then some things in English, but mostly Persian. Any more questions? Yes.
One last one, it's a little tangential, but when you were looking at Iran taking over some of the maritime role of Great Britain in the Persian Gulf, and as a gatekeeper into the Persian Gulf, did you see any conversations about influencing also the UK's role as a gatekeeper into the Red Sea, the Bab al-Mandab area? Maybe it's just
I haven't really come across anything mentioning the Red Sea, but the Indian Ocean. This was a big deal for Iran. The Indian Ocean was a big deal. Actually, you know, the Shah in 1968, he said, when the British go, there's no way back through the back door, and also no other external power will take up that position. So everybody has to stay out. This is our area. But throughout the 70s, he actually realizes he can't really protect the Indian Ocean himself. And then there was a very small US mission in the Indian Ocean, and the Soviet Union was sort of expanding its influence there. So then he actually asked the US, well, if we are actually against any external presence here, but if the Soviet Union is here, you have to be here too, and you have to expand the mission, which is also something you don't see in the literature, because the literature is so adamant on the Shah not wanting any external influence. But I think towards the end of the 70s, he also realizes he can't do it on his own, and he does need some support in containing, communist or Soviet infiltration of the Persian Gulf, but also the Indian Ocean. Yeah. I think that was it.